So earlier today, a friend of mine sent me an open letter from Robert P. George. He is a professor at Princeton University, and he wrote a open letter to the undergraduate fellows of the James Madison program. This is a political theory project at Princeton. And for those of you who don't know who Robert George is, he's a brilliant professor at Princeton. He's very conservative. He comes at law and policy and philosophy from a legal/religious perspective, and he's really like reviving natural law Catholic thinking on some of these issues. But more so than a professor at this point, he's also a public intellectual, and he's a real intellectual light and source of guidance for he's a public intellectual, really involved deeply with Republican politics and conservative politics beyond the academy. So George writes this letter where he basically condemns what he labels as a quote white supremacist group, which is coming to Princeton. He wrote this on Friday. And he repeats that this group that's going to organize a protest or a rally of some sort in the Princeton area, he repeatedly calls them white supremacists. And then he goes even further and he calls them evil. And he then basically concludes the letter by reiterating that he opposes white supremacy due to his belief in God and how his interpretation of religion does not allow for these kinds of why his view of religion does not condone white supremacy. And then he calls for what he calls a quote open and fair-minded way of having a conversation and interrogating why it is that we oppose white supremacy. Now, as you guys know, I mean, I've done a lot of research and thinking on the alt-right, white nationalism, and so forth, and I've looked into these communities for a long time, and something just didn't quite resonate with what Robbie George said. So I, literally spent about 10 to 15 minutes just researching what was actually going on. And what I found was something that was not exactly in line with what Professor George is arguing. So first of all, he didn't link to the group that was allegedly organizing the march, and we'll come to that. But the group in question here is the, quote, New Jersey European Heritage Association. Okay, so George didn't actually link to their site, but I went to it. And if you look at their website, what you find is that they actually never describe themselves as being white supremacists. But if you go to their homepage, their About Us page, and then they have some flyers of what they believe. I mean, this is presumably what they believe as an organization. I'll read some of what they write in their own words about what they say they are. Okay, so I'm quoting here. The white European peoples in America and abroad are racing towards the cliff of extinction. With white births below replacement levels, historical rates of intermarriage, and a tide of third world immigration flooding over the border, our people will be reduced to a minority within this century. The future of our world is a dark one, literally and figuratively. The non-whites who will come to replace us will recreate the failed societies they have fled. Our nations will be plagued with high levels of violence, poverty, corruption, and instability. Ask yourself, is this what the founding fathers wanted? Is this even what your grandparents wanted? More importantly, is this what you want for your children? We must wrest political, economic, and social control away from the hostile elite who have usurped power in America. Our creed can be summed up. So here now they're summarizing what they're about. Okay, our creed can be summed up by 14 simple words. We must secure the existence of our people and a future for white children. Okay, so this is what I gathered from their website. Now, I then sort of Googled a little bit more. I spent literally about 5 minutes here. Okay, just looking at some of the press coverage, and it turns out that there actually was no protest even happening. There's no actual protest, and the group did not even apply for a permit to a protest. So what you have here is the Princeton community going just absolutely AWOL. They're organizing counter protests. They're writing open letters. They're going hysterical. Then it turns out that this group, alleged white supremacist group, did not even file that they didn't even sort of apply for an actual protest permit. Okay, so they didn't even apply for one. And then here's what they said in their official statement. That this whole exercise that they did, where they were spreading this idea that they might organize a protest, was really, quote, an exercise demonstrating that the so-called tolerant, phony, privileged, limousine liberals of Princeton have no respect for freedom of speech. Okay, end of quote. So I think there's a number of things here that are worth commenting on. Okay, and I'll do it in the spirit of Professor George's call to ask why questions. And I'll list three big questions that came to mind as I did the research here. I mean, so here's my first question. I mean, number one, if one were actually to take these statements directly without context from the website of this group, and they took them to a random sample of registered Republicans who support Trump, would they be more likely to agree with them or disagree with them? Number two, are these statements generally in line with the sentiments and worldview of President Trump, populist intellectuals, and the mainstream of the Republican Party, or are they significantly, markedly different? And then number three, what are the policy prescriptions that naturally flow from this group on immigration, on trade, and entitlements, and do they differ in any meaningful respect from the demands of this White House and this presidency? Now, I mean, as you guys know from following my work and my writing and so forth, I mean, I'm openly, I'm a globalist. I favor open borders. I'm a free trader, and I basically advocate a race-neutral meritocracy. I'm pretty much agnostic about which groups rise and fall in America. I mean, if whites become a majority of America, great. If they're a minority, I don't care. You know, I just have other things that I care about. And I'm also not a part of the Republican Party. I've basically left it to join the Libertarians. So I know why I oppose this group, this NJEHA. And I'm happy to debate anyone from this group and judge them on the merits. The problem is that Professor George and the vast majority of Republican establishment intellectuals and conservative intellectuals and so forth, they're more than happy to virtue signal and go out there and condemn the so-called white supremacist groups. But even these people who are supposed tenured professors, they're supposedly in these established positions because of their high research skills. They'll never actually parse the statements, investigate the policy prescriptions, or publicly debate these people who are not actually, I mean, whether or not they're white supremacists, that's not what their political platform is about. That's not what they're talking about as political actors. What they're advocating for and talking about is something different. And they'll never actually debate these people. And there are plenty of these people who are very intellectual. Someone like Jared Taylor comes to mind, people at the American Renaissance and whatever. There's a whole community of these people who would gladly welcome a debate. And I'll offer a theory as to why public intellectuals on the Republican side and conservative intellectual movement won't actually take at face value what these people are talking about and engage them. And the answer is because doing so would raise uncomfortable questions about what the Republican base is really about, what is actually driving Republican voters today. And what you would find actually is that there actually isn't very much of a difference between the so-called white supremacist or white nationalist groups, both in terms of their overall kind of take on where American society is, what fears are driving them, what policy prescriptions they want, and where the Republican base today actually is. I think there is a notable rhetorical difference, but even that rhetorical difference is being largely diminished by the frank nature of how Donald Trump campaigned and even continues to behave as president. And the really scary thing, I think, for Republican and conservative elites is that if they were actually to take these people seriously and really, come to grips with what they're up against, what it would force them to do is that they would have to come to grips with the cognitive dissonance and the cynicism that is ultimately required of them if they are to align with and ultimately benefit from the Republican Party and the conservative mainstream that is now in power and beholden to a base of voters and a base of people who call themselves conservative, but I think at this point they're really virtually inseparable from the same group of people who are behind these so-called white supremacist movements. And that's why even when you see mainstream reporting, that's basically propaganda. I mean, it basically does not give these people a fair shake. Every time they get mainstream coverage, their numbers grow. More and more people get behind them. They grow more popular. They get more traffic to their websites. So so what I would say here is, what I would say here is that if we are going to, in fact, take issue with these people, then I think we need to use the terms that they do, take at face value what their arguments are, and really interrogate it and go after them. Okay, there's a comment here that I want to respond to. See, the other side, of course, is that the left routinely, relentlessly attacks white people, traditional America, whatever you want to call it, in a way that has left the country hopelessly balkanized on racial lines. Wonderful legacy from Barack Obama. I don't know. I mean, I think there's certainly an element of the American left that has played identity politics, that has gone too far and that is making people feel defensive on the right. Is it a legacy from Barack Obama? Maybe. I mean, I think on the one hand, a big part of Obama's rise to power was political correctness, and I think that that didn't begin with his presidential candidate. I mean, in some sense, it's an open question whether Barack Obama even would have been in the territory of becoming a presidential candidate were it not for affirmative action and other predominantly left-wing policies that are obsessed with a certain degree of racial equality and so forth. But I'm not sure that Obama is to blame for this rise of white nationalism and identity politics on the right. And I've written an article about this in the National Interest, but if you look on the eve of Barack Obama's election, these white nationalist, white supremacist groups were really on the defensive. I mean, they were basically defeated. And they made a comeback, and I think that there are a lot of reasons why they made a comeback, but I think one element of that is the fact that Donald Trump and a lot of these groups have basically tapped into fears that have resonated and permeated a great deal of sentiments in the Republican Party. In terms of a way forward, in addition to taking seriously these groups and actually kind of coming to terms with their arguments and debating them, I think the fact of the matter is that although I don't agree with these groups on this white nationalist right, I mean, I do think that they are, and I certainly don't agree with their rhetoric and how they're engaging. I do think that they're raising serious points that are resonating with the mainstream of the Republican Party. These are root level concerns about what it means to be American, what goes into identity, what citizenship should be based on, whether or not a genuinely multicultural society is tolerable, whether or not we should care about the racial balance in this country, whether or not the character of this country would change if we have unfettered immigration. I mean, these are all serious issues, and I think they need to be talked about and done so in a mature way. I mean, in terms of historical parallels, where I see really an analogy here is what the American left went through when it came to communism and socialism beginning in the 1930s, and I would argue really into the 80s, where in light of World War II and then the Depression and then the aftermath, I mean, there was a real debate on the American left about economics and the role of government and so forth, and there were a lot of people on the far left who were basically aligning with communist and socialist movements from around the world. These ideas were resonating with much of the base of the Democratic Party. They were becoming in the mainstream, and this was a real civil war and a debate on the left. And for a long time, Democratic Party elites and so forth basically denied the fact that there was genuinely sort of communist or socialist infiltration. But over time, basically, the Democratic Party came to grips with this and moved into a more mainstream direction and ultimately sort of produced an exodus of these people. And I think that this is a similar parallel that's happening on the right, where you have white nationalism really becoming mainstream of the Republican Party. And at least right now, Republican elites are far more interested in virtue signaling and kind of making these public pronouncements that separate themselves from these groups without really coming to grips with their critique and offering a coherent defense and an argument about why they should not be included. There's a comment here from Frank Smaltino. It's easy to hold a position of globalism, racial diversity when you're part of a majority or rising group. A subset of a defeated group or waning group will feel differently. Well, that's true. I mean, obviously, globalism or any policy has a set of winners and losers. And I think, obviously, if you're in an industry or whatever that's going to face more competition from a genuine capitalist order, a globalist order, a free trade order, I mean, it's not surprising that those on the other end of the spectrum will have concerns about it. That's what creative destruction is ultimately about. But what I don't think is inevitable is why economic gains and losses, which are a part of a competitive market system, why does the people on the so-called defeated end, why do they have to embrace racial grievances? Why do they have to embrace a more identitarian politics? I mean, I think this is the question that the Republican Party needs to grapple with, that, as a result of globalism, as a result of globalization, there absolutely is an upheaval happening in American society. You are seeing, for example, a erosion of social capital and so forth from certain parts of the country. You are seeing mass migration to urban areas. You are seeing wages and a plateau for some groups while seeing greater inequality. These are all serious concerns, but and I think that they probably are to some degree a factor in the rise of these identitarian movements. But it's not obvious to me that it's legitimate just because you have economic gains or losses for people to air their grievances in a racialized way. I mean, I think a much healthier solution to this problem would be for those who are on the losing end or feel like they're on the losing end of certain economic trends to figure out, one, why are they on the losing end, and two, what can they do about it? One of the ways out of this dilemma that I see is for mass migration out of the U.S. I mean, there are plenty of people in the middle class, upper middle class in this country whose skills and talents and so forth may be becoming outdated by technology, but who could absolutely move to a second world country or a developing part of the world, live in a place with a lower cost of living or standard of living, and really add value to a multinational company or some other country that's at a different phase of development. And I think that this would be a great win-win situation for everyone. I mean, I think another thing would be that rather having this pessimistic, dour view of what's going on, recognize, first of all, that even those who are, relatively speaking, maybe on the decline, that when you look at the opportunities for e-commerce or starting an online business or taking advantage of all the opportunities that are available with a simple internet connection, I mean, these are opportunities that any other generation would have dreamed about. And I don't know why this country and culture that historically has been opportunity oriented, has historically celebrated movement and capitalism, why are we sort of gravitating toward these grievances? But these are the kinds of questions that I have a perspective on, but they're very debatable, and I think that they need to be debated, and I think we need to take these arguments that white nationalist intellectuals and so forth are raising, and rather than dismissing them as being white supremacists, take their arguments, find the smartest people in these groups, and have a debate with them and have a discussion with them, bring them into the mainstream. And I think today, right now, Republican elites, conservative elites, many of whom are friends of mine, many of whom I agree with, I think are doing a disservice here by having such a dismissive and unserious tone and engaging with these debates.